is one of my absolute favorite passages, and coming from the book of Lamentations, because Lamentations, as we know, is crying, and so there's an awful lot of crying there, but the fact that his steadfast love is new every morning, this is great news. We are going to be talking about some other great news. We have been working through the book of Deuteronomy, and I decided that we're going to go through the book of Mark. We just kind of looked at things and we said, you know what? It has been 2014, 2015 since we've gone through a gospel. That's entirely too long. So we're going to go through the book of Mark and take a look at some things. And as we do that, there are some interesting parts that we take a look at. When we take a look at who wrote the books of the Bible, we think of Peter, we think of Paul, especially with all the letters. We think of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we take a look at some of these people and we think, okay, well, we know that Matthew was an apostle, and we know that John was an apostle, and we know that Peter was an apostle, and we know that Paul was one, as he called himself, abnormally born. He also was an apostle. But we have some other people who wrote Scripture, and God moved in their lives, inspired them to write as God saw fit. And one of those people is Mark. Luke is another one. We have Jude. We have James, the brother of Jesus. So we have, and the writer of Hebrews. We don't even know who wrote that one. So anyway, but we have these different books that were written by all sorts of people that God said, you know what? I need this to be said. This is important. And the important thing about Mark, I think, as we take a look at Mark is probably the first gospel ever written. And so we're talking about the time that 1 Corinthians was written, about the same time Mark is written. And we take a look at this and who in the world is Mark? Who is he? What is it about Mark that's interesting or important? And I think that the thing we find is Mark is a very interesting character in the Bible. We find him mentioned throughout, but the first mention that we have of him is in Acts 12. And what is happening in Acts 12 is that Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, and he intended to persecute them, and he took James, John's brother, not James, the brother of Jesus, but James, John's brother, the sons of Zebedee. He took James, and he put him to death, and he said, hey, you know what, the Jews are kind of liking this, so he took Peter and he threw him in prison, and Peter's in prison, and the church was praying for him, and the night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between two soldiers, bound with two chains, and two soldiers, bound with those chains. Sentries stood guard at the entrance, and the angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell, and he struck Peter on the side and woke him up. Quick, get up, he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrist. Now, Peter, as he's doing this, he thinks he's walking in a dream. He doesn't know exactly what is going on. But then, when the angel leaves him in the street, Peter came to himself, and he says, now I know without a doubt that the Lord sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were anticipating. When this had dawned on him, he said, I got to go somewhere. It's the middle of the night. Where am I going to go? And so what he does is he goes to the house of Mary, the mother of John, also called Mark. And so this is the first mention that we have of Mark at all. And many people were gathered there and they were praying, and it's kind of a funny story. Peter knocks on the door, and Rhoda takes a look. She's there, and she hears somebody knocking at the door, and she just leaves him there. And she comes back and says, Peter's at the door. Well, why didn't you open the door? No, I mean, if you don't think that Scripture is funny sometimes, it's funny sometimes. It's really funny. Human nature is funny, and I think that God has given us a sense of humor, and He's made us laugh for all sorts of reasons. And this is a funny story. But anyway, this is the first mention that we have of him. We notice that he goes on the first missionary journey. He goes on a missionary journey, with Paul. I'm going to get it, Paul and Barnabas, and we find this in Acts 12:28. What we have going on there is that they decide that they're going to go on this missionary journey, and so they take him along. He does not complete this trip, and if we take a look at Acts chapter 15, there's a situation in which Barnabas and Paul, they're talking with one another. They say, you know what, we need to go back around and we need to strengthen the churches that we've been to. And so we have this entire situation in chapter 15 and 36, and it says, sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns and we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with him in the work. Now, we don't know what the situation is. We don't know why in the world he had, quote-unquote, deserted them. We have no idea, but they had a disagreement. Barnabas goes one way with Mark. Paul takes Silas and they go in another different direction, and they strengthen the churches in the various places that they are going to. We find in Colossians 4:10, and we're not going to read that necessarily, but we find in Colossians that Barnabas was actually a cousin of Mark. And so this is another part of it. But I think that the really important thing that we can see in all of this is that Mark is very, very engaged with the early church. He is with the brothers and sisters. He is with those people who are making decisions. He is with people who know about what the Lord has done. He knows all about this. He's hearing the stories. He is absorbing all of this. And we see this in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 11. We find that Paul is now a very old man. And things are not necessarily going well with him. He's coming to the end of his ministry. He's coming to the end of his life. And he says to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:9, do your best to come to me quickly, for Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, because he is helpful to me in my ministry. We can take a look at this and we can think about how Paul really wasn't all that in Mark's corner in Acts chapter 15 early on in the ministry because of what he had done. But we see here that Paul is saying, you know what? That Mark, he's useful. I need him. Bring him along. And we find that also he was with Peter, and we see this in 2 Peter. I'm going to go there. 2 Peter 5:13. It's just a very short passage, and it's going to take me longer to get there than it's actually going to take me to read it. But what we have there in 5:13 is that, I'll get there. 5:13. It's very interesting. He says, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends her greetings, as so does my son, Mark. I don't think that we're talking about Peter actually being Mark's father, but what we are talking about here is that Mark is so important to Peter that he considers him a son in the faith. And so we have this entire particular situation. So basically, we find that Mark has moved in various circles with these apostles, with these early leaders of the church. He has been on missionary journeys. He has done a lot of things in his day. And we find that he is also writing Mark. He writes the Gospel of Mark, the first of the Gospel. And there are some things that we need to know about the Gospel of Mark too. One of the things that we need to realize is that it is a witness document. Okay? What we have here is we have a document that is bearing witness to the things that Jesus did and said. Now, I want us to be clear in all of this. This is not a history, and this is not a biography. If we take a look at what the purpose of a witness document is, we can take a look at it in Luke chapter 1. And we find that Luke, in his writing, and I think that it's interesting, he says this, he says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Now, get this, okay? Luke and Mark knew each other. Mark had already written his gospel. He has in mind Mark as one of those people who had written an account. He probably also has Matthew in mind. He probably doesn't have John in mind because John's the last one to write. Okay, so we have this situation. Why is he doing this? He says, therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Think about what you think about. This is meta. Think about what you think about when you are talking about an orderly account. We often think of in order of time. And a lot of people have taken a look at the book of Luke and said, that's the most chronological book of the Gospels. I'm not so convinced, because we see that Jesus is resolutely setting his face toward Jerusalem, and he takes an awful long time to get there. We have all sorts of things going on where it seems like this right here is not necessarily in a chronological order with anything else. When we think about an orderly account, I want us to think about it in terms of a witness document. Luke had a point. And his point was, I want you to know for certain the things that you have been taught. And so when I'm giving you an orderly account, what I'm doing is I am arranging this material that I've got so that you can see everything that happened for your salvation. And this is critically important. And it's critically important to Mark too. And so what they are doing is they're arranging this material and they're saying, you know what? This right here is a lesson that Jesus taught, or this is a miracle that he did. This is something that we learned, and it makes sense to talk about it in this spot because we're putting it in some kind of order that moves us along. If we think about it as parents, we have certain steps that we take to raise our kids. But the lessons that we teach them day in and day out don't necessarily come in chronological order. They come as life happens. And so when a kid does something wrong and we correct them in that wrong thing, we say, well, you know what? We need to wait for that because that's really a 9-year-old mistake, not a 7-year-old mistake. We don't do that. What we do is it comes when it comes. And then when they're 25 and they finally want to ask us questions about how it was you did such a great job with us, we can say, you relate. We can say, well, this is what we did here, and this is what we did here, and this is what we did here, and we were moving you along in this direction. That's what Mark is doing. That's what Luke is doing. That's what Matthew is doing. That's what John is doing. They're taking this material, and they're arranging it in such a way to bring people to faith. That's what they're doing. And we must understand that they are writing with a bias. Now, for those of us who are still in high school or anything like that, college, we understand something about bias, and one of the things that we understand about bias when we are in school is bias is bad. That's not true. Again, from a parent perspective, I have a certain bias. I want my kid to end up over here in this way. Believe me, I'm doing everything I can to make sure that they end up being a good, faithful person. I'm not going to say, well, you got several options in life, and you can choose this, and you can choose this, and you can choose this, and it really doesn't make any difference. 6 1/2 dozen the other, what you choose. That's not how we go about things. We have biases. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Jonah, Micah, Moses, Paul, Peter, Jude, you want to name them all, they had a bias, and their bias was, Jesus is not a take it or leave it. We're going to tell you what it is. And we want to convince you of this. We have a point, and we want you to get it. So we're writing from a faith perspective, and we want you to have that faith too. This is important. And we do not discount that simply because of bias. And Scripture tells us what these purposes are. If we take a look at Mark 1, chapter 1, it says, the beginning of the gospel about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Now that gospel, as we take a look at this is good news, isn't it? That's what it says. The beginning of the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It's not like, well, we'll just kind of evaluate and see. We'll kind of see how this all plays out. That's not the point. The point is that it is good news, and we want people to know what that good news is. And did I just, okay, I did not. I thought I accidentally clicked. If we take a look at the John passage, and this is a passage that I think we know very well, but it's John 20, verse 30 and 31. It says, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. I'm writing these things, and I'm writing it for a purpose. I'm writing that you may believe, and that you may have life in his name. That's the entire reason why I'm writing this book. By the way, it seems like John probably intended to end his book right there, but then he said, you know what, I got one more. And so he writes chapter 21. He didn't call it chapter 21, but he writes that too. He said, I got another thing. And then at the end of it, I love how he ends chapter 21, 25. It's like, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. And John probably thought, you know what, I could add another story, and I could add another story, and I could add another story, and there are so many good stories. But this is enough. This is what you need. This is how it's going. Mark has a certain bias, and what we find here is Mark has some main points, and these main points are, this is, in fact, good news. We have to understand that this is good news. The other thing, we talked about this last week during Easter, that death, burial, and resurrection is of first importance. Mark gets that. The gospel writers get that. They understand that completely, and they are intent on letting us know about these things. So we have early on in Mark's gospel, and Mark doesn't have a lot of the things that Matthew and Luke has as far as Jesus' birth. In fact, he cuts that out completely. That's not part of his purpose. But we find that very early on, he starts talking about his death. And so in chapter 2:20, but the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm not sure where we're going with that. That's okay. We go to 3:5. He looked around at them in anger, and he just their stubborn heart said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. This is the earliest we get in any of the Gospels about, oh, guess what? They intend to kill him. It's part of the plan. It's part of the plan. We get to 8:31, and we'll come back to 8 in just a little bit, but when we take a look at 8:31, we have Jesus saying, he began to teach the disciples that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. And he spoke plainly about this, and we understand that Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, and that's where Jesus says, out of my sight, Satan, you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. So it's part of the plan. Again, it is God's plan that this is happening. It is of absolute first importance. When we take a look at 10, and it gets more fast and furious and becomes a lot more specific as we go through the book. We have in 33, we are going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death. Okay? First important stuff here. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. This is good news. Throughout all the pain, throughout everything that was going on, it's good news. Finally, when we get to Mark 16:16, again, this is good news. What we have here is we have the resurrection, and we have the Sabbath, and we have the Sabbath, and then we have the day after the Sabbath, Sunday, and Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might anoint Jesus' body. And very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. He said, don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. Go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you again to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. This is part and parcel of what is of crucial importance, and Mark peppers his gospel very liberally with death, burial, and resurrection. And finally, we have this confession that Jesus is the Christ. And we talk about this confession. We talk about the importance of that. We talk about Jesus is Lord, and we talk about how important that is. We have Jesus in chapter 8. And really, chapter 8 is one of those very, very critical, when we're looking at chapter 8, 27 and following, we're looking at a critical passage in Mark. We see a sea change after 8, 27 through 30. And we'll see it again, bookend at the end. But what we have here is Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." This is of crucial importance. And what we find going on in chapter 16, we have the Jewish population, we have a representative of the Jewish population in Mark 8 acknowledging Jesus as the Christ. But what we have in chapter 15 is something else. And we have the death of Jesus in chapter 15:33, and it says, "At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which means, 'My God, why have you forsaken me?' When some of those standing near heard this, they said, 'Listen, he's calling Elijah.' One man ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. 'Leave him alone now. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down,' he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, 'Surely this man was the Son of God.'" And so we have the Jewish population represented in Peter in chapter 8. We have the Gentile population in Mark chapter 15 acknowledging Jesus is the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah. We will be looking through Mark very systematically. I don't know how long it will take. Tim has been going through a lot of the Gospels and going through some of these stories using several different books. I'm going to focus on Mark. And if Tim goes there in his class, that's okay. We'll double dip. I think it's one of those things where iron sharpens iron, and I've been inspired by what I've heard in class to focus on the book of Mark. But what I want us to see is at some point, what we find is that everyone is at some point going to acknowledge Jesus as Lord. Whether it's in this life or the next one. Paul says, every knee shall bow, every tongue will confess Jesus is Lord. And so we offer an opportunity to do that here while we are alive so that we can spend eternity with him in heaven. That is our desire. That is our goal. That is what we want more than anything else. And when we confess Jesus as Lord, what we're saying is we are submitting ourselves entirely to you, Lord. Whatever your will is, that is the will that we want to have. We want to make our will align with your will. We want to make sure that we are following exactly what you want us to do. And so when we say Jesus is Lord, what it means is we are making a confession and we're saying, I'm going to follow you. If we say Jesus is Lord and don't do what he says, then we're really not saying that Jesus is Lord. And so we offer an opportunity to join with Jesus in his death, burial, and resurrection, because being under the lordship of Jesus is accepting him on his terms. And so we offer an invitation every single week to put yourself to death in the waters of baptism and become up a new creature, ready and eager to live out the life that says Jesus is Lord. If that is your decision today, please come as we stand.